All right. Last week, I think we got up to page 33 in the notes about God creating, and we are now on the doctrine of creation, right? And of course, Guthrie's little title is, what are we doing here? I always like to think about, movies like the Hitchhikers of the Galaxy, and we've been trying to figure this out. That question we've been chewing on for a long time, and yeah. So, all right. So last week we talked about point 3 or number 3. There is only one God alone who is creator and ruler of everything that is. And we ended last week by talking about it is a protest against all forms of dualism. And the two common ones are there are two eternal powers at work in the world, and there is a battle between the good and the divine evil. Again, there is one creator and ruler of this world. So, dualism, there is the form of dualism that is blatant, it's very obvious. So you would say, okay, there's a good being, a bad being, or a good God and a bad God. Some people say, well, like Star Wars, right? Kind of, you have a force that could be used for the good or for the bad, right? But we don't really have a system, like Christianity doesn't have a system where you have a good God and a bad God. Some heretics have toyed with the idea, kind of like, I want to say it was Marcion who said you have, the God of the Old Testament is a brute, and then Jesus in the New Testament is this loving, kind God, compassionate God, which of course, is in my opinion, a very huge stretch of what they're looking at. So that's one thing. So to look at it and say there are two beings, right? Two beings dueling for the universe. The other is it's a battle between good and divine evil, right? So you would think about two beings fighting, and this is where a lot of people would give too much credit to the creature of the devil, or Lucifer or Satan or whatever kind of angelic fallen host you want to think about. That mankind is just this pawn in between this cosmic battle between these two spiritual beings. And so we must be careful when we think about dualism, right? That's not, God created everything, none of God's creation is even close.
If there is a devil, he's not at the same level.
Correct. Not even, right, not anywhere near.
He likes to think he is.
Yeah, he likes to think he is, right. But he's not, right. Exactly. Not even close. Not even close. The Creator is powerfully above and independent of the created world, but also lovingly present and at work in it. I think this is what we ended with last week. So this is where we kind of throw out the concept or the idea of a deist theology, right? So a deist would say, yes, a creator is above and independent of the created world, right? Like
very independent.
Extremely independent. Like, I'm going to build this, and then, I'm going to take, the Father, Son, and the Holy Ghost take the last train for the coast, and they're gone, as Don McLean would sing. So that's part of it, and that would be your deist theology, but also a lovingly present and at work in it. So not only did God create everything, but God decides to stick around and to be present, in at work, lovingly involved with God's creation, right? So when we think about that, it's important to get both pieces when we look at God's involvement within the universe. That it's not just a creator, but it's someone who has stuck around. We have seen repeatedly that biblical Christian faith emphasizes both the sovereign power of a transcendent God over all created reality and the nearness of an immanent God in and for all created reality. One of the most difficult problems of a Christian doctrine of creation is the problem of maintaining a proper balance between these two emphases. Every attempt to talk about the relation between a creator and creation tends to defend one at the expense of the other. As we now look at three main ways in which Christians in our time talk about how God is related to the world, which seems to you to do the best job of preserving both the transcendence and the immanence of God. So what we're going to do is look at three examples of this, or three ways we can look at this. All right. So the first, and don't pick on my little designs. I did this long before. I want to say I did this back in 2004. So imagine the technology I had to do this with. So I don't know if this was like PowerPoint or some kind of.
I don't know, man. I was using Illustrator back then. It was
Yeah, well,
powerful.
you were a lot more tech savvy than I was. My nose has always been in 2,000-year-old books.
Right.
All right. So, welcome, Alan. We're talking about three different ways to look at how God interacts or is a part of God's creation. So the first is theism. All right, and if you look at the little diagram, you have two circles with God in the top, us or the world in the bottom, and which way is the arrow pointing?
Down.
Down, right? So from God to us. The word theism comes from the Greek word. Does anyone know what the Greek word theism comes from?
I guess isn't it the root of theology?
Yes. So theos, yeah. Good, excellent. The word theos, which means,
Theology.
well,
God.
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 So theos is the root of theology, right? Theology, the study of God.
Right.
A theist, then, is a religious person, a philosopher or theologian, Christian or not, who believes in the ultimate reality of God, as opposed to an atheist who does not. The traditional Christian doctrine of creation is based on a Christian version of theistic thinking in general. From a biblical point of view, the strength of Christian theism is its clear insistence on the great distance and difference between creator and creation, and on the absolute power of the creator over creation. Its weakness is what? Looking at this diagram. Well, what is its strength? Looking at this first diagram.
The fact that God's involved with us.
Well, it's not so much involved, it's more of that's a weakness of this.
Mhm.
Because in this one, God is not so much involved, but
He's running the show.
yeah, God runs the show, sets it up, but it's just God doing it.
Can I
So-
have one of those papers?
Yes.
Oh, see,
Do we need an extra?
Oh, here's one.
I thought I had one. Right here?
The backside.
Here?
Yeah.
Oh.
So this one shows that there's absolute power of God over creation. But the weakness is it doesn't really show any of God's loving. You know, it's like a one-way street.
One-way street,
Yeah,
yeah.
it's over creation, but that's all that this shows. Right? And remember, we talked, God, I can't tell you how many months ago, but we had talked about the importance of symbolism. Remember when we looked at the Trinity, you know, and the traditional
Yeah.
logo or illustration is triangle, right? But the problem is when we do the triangle, right, it's always the Father on top, and then Jesus and the Holy Spirit on the bottom 2 points. And so theologically that's not wrong, but you know, when you want to talk about the equality of God, an equality of the members of the Trinity, we always think of, okay, well, you're at the top of the triangle or pyramid, then you are the most important. And this is why now more of the theme that we actually have in our sanctuary are the three rings, right? And that's the Trinitarian rings, and that's used in many churches, Protestant and Roman Catholic. So when you see those three rings, it means the same thing, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, but they're interchangeable. They all meet in the middle. So these diagrams, hopefully we're going to, you see the same thing in this. Bless you. So God controls everything, but God in this diagram in theism is safely removed from it, right? It's like God doesn't have to get dirty taking care of creation, right? God is kind of away. Reminds me of when I was a kid and when people would describe God to me, like in my own family, and say, the man upstairs. That was a common term that I heard as a kid.
Sure.
The man upstairs. And so, as a kid, when you think about that, well,
Why does the term theism describe this specific relationship? I would think theism would just be like any belief in God.
It is. Yes, it's theism is any belief in God, but this model, it talks about that there is a God and that God created.
Okay.
So this is just a basic, and remember Guthrie said initially this doesn't have to be a Christian or not.
Right.
This is just any belief that a God created.
Yeah,
The
but that's
world.
why I'm confused why there is this arrow going one way, because it seems to me that the arrow could be going any way as long as you believe in God.
Yeah, yes. All right, I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
Yes, the person believes in the God, but God, in this model, it's just that God creates things, but God is kind of not like an absentee landlord, but there's not much of this.
But I'm just not clear on why. I mean, I would consider myself a theist in general, a Christian in specifics.
Yes, and there will be a
So-
better model to explain that.
Okay.
I think this model is just saying that, yes, you believe that there's a God, but there's no...
I just don't understand why there's anything, if it's just theism, that should just mean belief in God. I don't understand why there's specific dogma attached to it.
Well, there's not. It's just saying that in this model, it's like thinking that there is a God, and you believe that there's a God, but there's no clear presence about the God as a loving God or someone who works personally
Okay, so,
within creation.
okay.
Yeah. But yes, I understand what you're saying. And he mentioned, just a tidbit before we move to the next model, atheism, right? That there is no God, a belief in no God. It's interesting that in English it's atheism, but it's not an A, it's a what. When you think of the term atheism, it's a transliteration, but it's really an alpha, right? It's a Greek word, atheism. And in Greek, if you put an alpha in front of a word, if the word starts with an alpha, that's different. But if the word does not start with an alpha and then an alpha is added to the beginning of the word, alpha is kind of like how...
Anti?
Yes. It's like how we put a non in front of a word.
Mm-hmm.
So like...
Atheist,
like-
anti-theist.
Yes. So like you have... if you have the term binding, and then you put non in front of it, non-binding.
Yeah.
It's a non-binding document. So an alpha in front of theos or theism means no God, right? So it negates the word, right? So that's why that is the way it is. And then agnostic, gnosis, right? Another Greek word, knowledge. You put the alpha in front of it, and then it becomes agnostic. There is no knowledge, right? So an atheist says there is no God, An agnostic says,
Maybe.
maybe, we don't know.
Right.
No way to tell, no way to find out,
Right.
right? So that's how that works, right? So again, it's interesting because if you think of it as an A, just okay, that's the word they chose. But it's the actual alpha that does the negating of the word. All right, so that's the first model. The God of theism, the God we meet in the Old Testament story of God's faithful covenantal relationship with Israel, the God who shares the humiliation of the defeats and failures of God's people, as well as giving them victory and success, the God who sticks with them even in their constantly repeated sinful rebellion. Is this the God of theism? The God we meet in the story of a human creature who is called God with us is the God who promises by God's Spirit to dwell in us. It is not surprising that just because they want to be biblical thinkers and not just theists, that some Christians in our time have looked for other models to think about the relationship between creator and creation. To say that this model does some to explain the relationship, but it might not go far enough. So, the next model is pantheism, right? Pantheism is a combination of the Greek word pan, which means, does anyone know what pan means?
Everything.
All, yep, everything. And theos, God. In contrast to various forms of theism that says that everything comes from God, pantheism says that everything
Is God.
is God. Excellent. A common way of describing it is to say creator and creation are related as soul and body are related in a human being. The world is God's body, the external self-expression of the internal reality and life-giving presence of God. Pantheism, long rejected as a heresy by Christian tradition, has gained advocates, especially among some contemporary Christians concerned about the ecological crisis of our time, because they believe that it makes unmistakably clear the fact that our offenses against our natural environment are offenses against God, an attack on God's own body, as they put it. So pantheism, which is saying that everything is God, creation is God, this has been rejected by Orthodox Christianity for a very long time. I don't think it's ever been close to being accepted by Orthodox Christians.
Right.
And when I mean Orthodox, I'm not talking about fundamentalism. I'm talking about just the traditional views
Right.
of the church, right? They have rejected pantheism. So that God is in the world is God, everything is God. And I thought it was very interesting, the descriptor that Guthrie said that it's kind of made a comeback. And things like this, and things do make comebacks. The way we look at theology, runs in trends sometimes. So some things you say, well, that was an old one, but no, Guthrie brings up the point that it's rearing its head again within Christian circles, and it seems like in a way it's being brought up to try to make a defense to say, well, we should take care of creation. And yes, I agree, we should take care of creation, right? We are stewards. But I know, as a theologian, I would say it doesn't mean that you have to equate a tree to being God.
Right.
It's just, as a Christian, we are called to be stewards, so we should take care of what we have to take care of.
Right.
Right? That's it. But some people will go to the extreme and say, well, to protect it, this is what, how we should look at it. Right? So just because it might be an ancient heresy doesn't mean that it's gone forever. Right? It means that it can pop up again, depending on what is going on around you within your culture, within society, because that's what creates these heresies to begin with. Right? Is something going on, or an individual, looking around and saying, "Well, I don't really agree with the Orthodox here, and I'm going to go off on my own." I'm sure to the Roman Catholic Church, Martin Luther, his thoughts and beliefs might still be heretical. Again, it's whose side you're on. To the Protestant churches, we look to Martin as, okay, way to go, Martin. You did this for us. And then it doesn't mean that on the other side, he's not looked at as a theological terrorist, because you think of what he did. So, again, there are two sides of a coin. So what we look at here and what we're discussing are orthodox point of views, right? This is what we're trying to get to. All right, now, the third model, which is the one you don't hear about as often, and it's always a little bit of a tongue twister to get it out, panentheism, right? It's not pantheism, it's panentheism. Panentheism says that everything that exists is in God. The world is in God, and God is in the world. Of several possible versions of panentheism, the version proposed by contemporary Reformed theologian Jürgen Moltmann is perhaps the most impressive attempt to find a way for Christian thinking about the relation between Creator and creation that preserves the strengths and avoids the weaknesses of both theism's emphasis on God's transcendent existence apart from the world and of pantheism's emphasis on immanent presence of God in the world. According to Moltmann, God, who is all in all, the only reality there is, made and continues to make room within God's self for the life different from God. This means, as theism insists, that the world is always dependent on God and can never be confused with God, but also means, as pantheism insists, that God is never separated from the world, but always, at every moment, dwells within it as a source of its life. The best analogy for this understanding of the relationship between Creator and creation, Moltmann suggests, it is not the creative power of a father who engenders and rules over life outside himself, but that a mother who makes room for and nourishes new life within her own body. The life of the child she bears is at once totally dependent on her, yet has an independent life of its own. All right, so that would be how Moltmann would describe this type of understanding, right? So a mother and child, right? A mother and child. This Christian panentheism may sound strange to those of us who have learned to think theistically about the relation between God and the world, but does not Scripture itself teach that all life comes from the gift indwelling of God's Spirit? Does it not teach specifically about the God who comes to us in Jesus Christ, that in Him all things in heaven and on earth were created? Christian panentheism is one way of proclaiming the good news that our God really is omnipresent and ever-present. It is also one way of proclaiming good news about our own lives. God is behind and above and under and in front of us. We come from God as we go on our way. God looks down on us with a kindly eye. God upholds us with protecting and helping hand, and God's life-giving Spirit dwells within us, and we go to meet God. At every moment, past, present, and future, we are surrounded by God. We live not only from, but in God. All right.
So the N, does that mean in? Is it saying?
Yes.
So it's basically saying all in God?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, all in God and God in all.
Got it.
So I'm going to read section 1. In the last analysis, neither theism nor pantheism nor panentheism can explain the mystery of the relation between the Creator and the Creator's good creation. So Guthrie would say, although each of these might have some, although I don't know how much Guthrie would agree with pantheism, but Guthrie might, look at theism and say panentheism offers some of the answer. each of these theories or models says something important things and leaves other important things unsaid. What is important is that we criticize and learn from each of them in light of biblical witness to a creator who always, with all creatures, is a transcendent God, powerfully independent of the created world and everything in it, yet also an immanent God who in self-giving love is present and at work in the created world and everything in it. So Guthrie says, okay, these three models, they might have something right, but they don't go far enough, or they go too far in directions which Guthrie would say no, right? So when we think of creation, we need to think of God's good creation, and we're going to end with this today, and I'll read you his statement. God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. From Genesis chapter 1. The created world is good, and life in it is good. They are good because a good God made them, continues to give them life, and promises them new life. We have already emphasized as strongly as possible that all that God created is good, not just human beings, but also the world of our natural environment and all life in it. And we have emphasized that this means that we are to respect, value, protect, and work for the welfare of the whole created world. Now, we will concentrate on what it means for us to recognize specifically human life as God's good creation. It is true that we human beings, like no other creatures as far as we know, rebel against our Creator, misuse God's good creation, and make ourselves and others miserable because of our rebellion. Immediately after the creation story comes the beginning of the long story that still continues of human sin and its consequences. But neither the Bible nor genuinely Christian theology says that God's good creation has become a bad creation. Okay? The evil that invades God's good creation is not stronger than the Creator. It cannot change the essential goodness of what God creates. So before we try to understand the evil that is an intruder in God's world, we must try to understand that it means to believe that despite everything that spoils and corrupts it, we live in a good world, and it is good to be alive in it. It means in general that unlike some other religions and unlike some common perversions of Christianity, the Christian faith is a world-affirming and not a world-denying faith. Christians do not affirm the world because they are optimistic about the world as such and unrealistic about all the suffering and injustice in it. They affirm it because God created it and says yes to it. Even when evil invaded it and seemed to gain control over it, God did not abandon and turn against the creatures who had turned against their Creator. In the life and death of Jesus, God entered into the fallen world to suffer with it and for it. In the resurrection of Jesus, God reclaimed what had already belonged to God and asserted again God's power and loving lordship over the world, for the world. In the future, God promises not only a new heaven, but a new earth. Christians then are world-affirming because they believe in a world-affirming God. To seek escape from worldly life and worldly responsibilities and pleasures is to seek escape from God. Otherworldly spirituality may seem very pious, but it is not Christian. It is pious rebellion against God, the creator of heaven and earth and everything in them. So we will look more specifically at two of these characteristics of the worldly Christianity that follow from the Christian doctrine of creation. So, again, Guthrie, his big point in this large couple of paragraphs is that, good morning,
Morning.
is that God's creation is what?
Good.
Good. Yeah. It always was good. It always will be good. Now, Guthrie describes sin and evil as what? He used a term. I like the term he uses.
I missed it.
An invader.
Uh-huh.
As a presence, as a form that gets in and mars things up, mucks things up, right? As Reformed theologians, we tend to say sometimes, you know, a condition, a broken condition, a fallen condition that we all have to traverse in, right? So it's not just this condition that humans deal with, but all creation deals with this, right? Everything lives, but then everything also does what? Dies. Yeah, everything lives and everything dies. But theologically, Guthrie brings out that even though there is this invasion of sin and bad or evil, whatever you want to call it, it doesn't mean God is, again, like Don McLean says, packed up bags and said, well, you guys ruined this place, I'm out. It doesn't mean that God is absent. It means that God is still at work and that creation is still good, right? I love thinking about the story, and we just talked about this in our Bible study on Acts, right? When Peter is having a vision of the sheet that is lowered down from heaven, remember? And there's all food on it, all kinds of animals.
Mm-hmm.
To a Jew, some of these animals are clean and good to eat, but some of them are not.
Mm-hmm.
And Peter says, whoa, what is that? What is that? And these are unclean, you know, and God says, eat. I've never eaten anything, and he hasn't, right? I mean, God knows that. You know, these are unclean, and then God tells Peter in a vision, everything I make is clean. Everything is good, right? Now, of course, God is talking about the Gentiles, right? He's not telling them to go to the Golden Corral and pig out on ham and ribs. He's preparing him to go to the household of Cornelius. So, when we think about this, it's good. Creation is good, and God says creation is good, right? There are things within creation that have kind of turned things screwy, but it doesn't mean that creation is still not good. It doesn't mean every time a little sapling starts to grow that it's not good, right? It doesn't mean that every time a baby is born, that is not good. It is good. Right? Again, we are in a condition. We are God's creations. It's like saying that, well, God created a bad person. God doesn't create bad things. Now, you're already thinking, and that's good, because I want you to start thinking, because there is clear evil in the world. Right? And theologically, we will begin discussing that, if not next week, the week after. Because how do we deal with the clear evil? Theologically. And that's important that I say theologically. Because remember, what we are doing is describing things. Describing the process. So we'll say, like when we just spent like 500 weeks on predestination. Because that's where you do spend all your time. Because it is hard. People are saved by God. But this is how we explain the process. So, United Methodists will explain the process differently than we do. And Roman Catholics will describe the process different than the way we and the Methodists do. And then Lutherans might come and say, oh, you're all wrong. This is how we explain the process. And then the Baptists will say, this is how it's done. But you know what? What happened is the same. That doesn't change. Right? That person is saved by God. It's how to explain the process that is different. Right? What happened, happened. That doesn't change. That's the same for all Christians. But how we describe it changes. Now, how we look at evil in the world, when God creates everything good, that's what we will get to over the next couple of weeks. Because remember, theology is like building blocks, is like logic, is like studying math. You have to make it fit within the system. It doesn't let people off the hook. It means it's put together differently. So Guthrie will get there, and I assure you that's one of my favorite chapters when we talk about evil in the world, because how Guthrie describes how it works. Right? All right, we will pick up next week with point 1 under Roman numeral 4. See y'all in church.